Good afternoon and welcome to the Greek Economic Summit. I'm Chryssos Kavounides. I'm a managing director and partner at Boston Consulting Group. And together we'll be discussing for the next 25 minutes a critical topic for governments and businesses and individuals equally, shaping the climate path to decarbonization. For us at BCG, this is a critical topic. As a firm, we have committed to net zero climate impact by 2030 and being climate positive thereafter. But the biggest impact we can have is working with our clients, working together with fora such as COP26, participating in initiatives such as the Breakthrough Energy Catalyst or the Aviation Climate Task Force that can accelerate technologies that will help us fight climate change in an accelerated way going forward. Here in Greece, we're extremely proud of our contribution, having contributed to the delignitization master plan in the context of the just transition from coal and lignite. In our discussion today, I'm extremely pleased to have a colleague from BCG, Jens Burchardt. Jens, welcome to the Greek Economic Summit. Jens,
thank you very much for having me.
Jens is a global expert on the topic and the co-founder of BCG's Center for Climate and Sustainability. He advises the private sector, the public sector, including the World Economic Forum, COP26, and a number of government commissions on how to successfully approach low carbon economies and how to win with low carbon technologies. Jens, it's great having you with us today. Thank you for being with us. We've managed to have a 1 degree of global warming impact on the world. We've put 2.5 billion people at risk of the effects of climate change. And only a month ago at COP26 is probably the first time we could say that we've seen the world really recognize that, and in one way or another, 90% of the world really aligned behind the net zero challenge. The extent of those commitments, and more importantly, how we get there, is still quite fuzzy, quite unclear. As someone who's been working in this field for a very long time and follows this very closely, please help us understand what are the key takeaways we should take from COP26. And also, how do you assess the progress that has been made in real terms over the last period?
I mean, one colleague of mine, I can't take credit for that, he said, and I think he put it quite well, COP26 over-delivered against the politics, but under-delivered against the science. And I think that's quite an accurate statement for where we stand. I think if you look at it politically and look at how much people were concerned about a lack of progress during these rounds of climate negotiations, I think it produced quite a lot of quite stunning successes. 90% of the world, as you said, are now committed to net zero. We've completed the Paris rulebook. Parties aligned to phase down coal and fossil fuel subsidies. So for the first time, we didn't only discuss about targets, but about actual measures, even though the wording was watered down a bit in these last negotiations. There were a lot of coalitions of the willing, which was a first between countries on topics like deforestation, methane emissions, international coal financing, the ICE exits. You had a joint declaration of China and the US indicating more willingness to work together on this topic. There was a lot of private sector action for the first time, including many quite ambitious coalitions that you mentioned. So all in all, we did cement the expectation that more needs to happen, and that countries also still will need to increase their ambitions. But if we are totally honest, with the commitments that have been achieved, the 1.5 degree target is basically dead. To save this, all major emitters would have to commit to extremely material action during this decade already, and especially during this decade until 2030, the commitments made just aren't sufficient yet.
So great progress, but the ambition still needs to be higher. In terms of, if we focus on Europe a bit, Europe has made some quite significant, quite ambitious commitments, and those are then supported by the EU Green Deal. Lots of numbers, lots of different commitments and targets across different sectors, across different activities. Can you give us a quick lowdown of what some of these mean, and where we are today? Do you feel that these are feasible for Europe?
First of all, let's look at what we've committed to. The EU Green Deal indeed tries to cement Europe's position as a leading force on decarbonization globally. We have committed with it that we aim to be the first carbon neutral continent in the world by reaching net zero in 2050, and probably even more importantly, have increased our emission reduction ambitions in 2030 from minus 40% versus 1990 previously to minus 55% now. Now, these are comparatively anonymous numbers, and 30 years feels like a long time in the future. What people underestimate a bit in our perspective is that most of our emissions are tied to individual assets, and many of these assets have extremely long lifetimes. A car, at least 15 years, an industrial CHP, 20 years, a gas boiler, 25 years, and so on. And what this means, and what the fact means that Europe now has to cut emissions by 40% in the next 10 years, is that this transition has to happen now. And we've looked at, we've discussed a lot about end dates and emission reduction target percentages, but in our view, not enough yet about what these targets actually mean. And what we've done is looked a bit at what would actually need to happen in the different sectors. And you would have to say that those are quite drastic things now that need to start this decade. In industry, to give an example, starting in about the middle of the decade, all companies across Europe essentially would need to stop reinvesting into fossil assets. So whenever a CHP, a gas boiler, in an industrial process is up for reinvestment, you would have to move to an entirely renewable alternative. So power-based or biomass-based, eventually hydrogen. We will need to completely replace quite a significant share of assets in our heavy industry. So steel, for example, we basically need to close down all blast furnaces all across Europe and replace this with new processes called direct reduction incineration, which run on low carbon hydrogen. Similar efforts need to be undertaken in chemicals. We need CCS in cement in the long run. In transport, we need to exit selling new ICE cars latest by the year 2035 in countries like Germany, far before that. We need to accelerate building renovations quite significantly, have to essentially stop replacing gas or oil boilers all across Europe within the next probably 5 years. In energy, have to triple the build-out speed of renewables, have to invest significantly into grid infrastructure, exit coal much, much earlier than most countries currently anticipate. So it's not just an acceleration of what we're doing that we have to be aware of. It is a quite drastic deviation from the status quo that's now needed, and that will need to be communicated to people, and it will need to be regulated. Do I think that's possible? Absolutely. But I don't think we should kid ourselves that this is a future problem. It's a problem today. And we shouldn't kid ourselves that this will be an enormous challenge, even for a comparatively wealthy continent like Europe.
Jens, so what I'm hearing from you is doable, extremely ambitious, requires significant focus and investment, and in fact, probably heavily front-loaded. What does that mean for a European economy? Because, by the sound of that, the numbers we're looking at, even at the EU Green Deal, are going to dwarf what's needed in terms of at least financial investment in this transformation. So what does that mean for European businesses, for the European economy more widely, for European businesses? And how is that affected by the pace at which other regions in the world progress? And will that create competitive disadvantages or competitive advantages for European business and Europe more widely?
So right now, it indeed seems that that Europe will be moving faster than most other regions in the world, and that especially within these coming 10 years, we will already do more in industries that are exposed to international competition, that are comparatively emission intensive than other countries will. More broadly, in our perspective, this notion of a first mover disadvantage, that we will wreck our economies if we move faster, in our view, that's bogus. There are industries where this is an enormous risk, where industries that are very, very emission intensive, where levers that you need to invest in to bring down emissions are comparatively expensive. So your cost per ton of avoided CO2 is very high, and where in industries you don't earn a lot per ton of CO2 you currently produce. In those industries, decarbonization will have quite a significant impact on product costs. So if we take steel as an example, moving to hydrogen-based steel can increase German steel production prices by somewhere in the ballpark of 50% or so per ton of steel. And that, for an industry that is in an international commodity market, is of course a risk. And there are several industries like this where you have these risks. Those are, next to steel, also base chemicals, some base metal production. Those are also industries like shipping and aviation. But what we, in my view, often mischaracterize is that this isn't the problem of the European industry. It's a problem of very specific industry sectors. And these industry sectors we can find tailored solutions for. Those industries that I just mentioned, including aviation and shipping, those make up in Europe about 2% of our entire GDP. So yes, we need to enact measures to protect these 2%, and we need to find ways to regulate these industries that enables them to keep on their businesses and to stay competitive. But it's a different challenge than risking your entire industrial value creation. For the rest of Europe, this whole transformation primarily is a significant growth program. To reach net zero by 2050, we need to invest all across Europe somewhere in the ballpark of 10 trillion euros over the next 30 years. And these 30 trillion euros, we invest very often into things where we displace consumption of fossil fuels, which we currently primarily have to import. That's GDP deflating, with investments in capital goods like windmills, solar farms, heat pumps, which we to a much larger degree produce in Europe. So for a continent like Europe, where we almost exclusively import our energy today, and where we pay very, very little on average for capital, this should create net growth. So we should do it, in our perspective, no matter what.
Clear. So overall, economically positive, but of course, in specific sectors, we need to address those carefully. Jens, we've heard a lot about global collaboration and coordination, and the fact that this is probably the single most globalized, let's say, problem and initiative and effort, if you like, in human history, possibly. And you have, in many of your pieces of work in the past, including the climate paths for Germany, you've made a very specific point about the collaboration also between the private and public sector, and that this is super critical for a successful transition and for accelerating the transition in Europe, but also globally. Why is that so important in this particular instance around sustainability and climate, that collaboration? And given the business leaders and the government representatives that are watching today, what advice would you give based on what you've seen so far on how to do that in the best possible way?
So maybe in a few seconds what we did over here. Germany has an even more ambitious emission reduction target than the European Union does. We want to almost halve our emissions by 2030 and achieve net zero by 2045. And so far, our policy is not in line with this ambition. So what we did over the past 6 to 8 months is sit together with a very broad panel of German industrial companies, more than 80 companies across all different sectors. And we looked at, okay, now we have these targets. What is actually needed to achieve them in terms of what are the technical levers that we need to implement in every sector? What are the barriers we need to overcome to make that happen? And how would a regulation program that gets to these targets actually have to look like? Which measures, which policies would you need to enact? What are actually the policies that can help the steel industry transform without threatening its economic competitiveness? And we've developed this program and introduced it in time for Germany's election. A lot has now actually been included in the policy plans of the new coalition. And in our view, these type of, it's not a public-private partnership per se, but a public-private dialogue offer that in our view is something that can serve a bit as a blueprint for what needs to happen in other countries as well. What I would stress, I don't think we necessarily need collaboration. What we really, really need is regulation. This won't happen if policymakers aren't willing to regulate this a lot stricter. What our project did is identify how this regulation would need to look like, and why I think it's better to have a dialogue about how this works. Is that, I mean, what lies before us in Europe and the rest of the world is essentially nothing less than the largest transformation we've probably ever had in our economies, in peace times at least. And this means in every sector, we will very fundamentally transform realities, we will transform business models. And this, of course, happens better if you coordinate. And that, of course, happens better if it's done in dialogue between policymakers and the private sector, and not by policymakers against the private sector. What this requires from policymakers is openness to this dialogue. What it requires from corporations is a different approach to advocacy, in our view. In the past, there are too many companies, if we are very honest, for whom advocacy and lobbying has been very much about preserving the status quo. In a world in which the status quo goes against the interest of humanity, this is a losing battle, and smart companies understand that what regulators need to develop their sectors towards, and come with solutions that help them transform their businesses, not defend something that's in the end not defendable.
Jens, we're talking about the largest transformation, as you said, that we've probably ever seen in our economies. It needs to be, it requires significant focus. It requires, you said, regulation, front loading, which means that very intense years to come. It all seems extremely difficult, extremely complex. But having heard you talk about this many times, I also know that you're also extremely positive and confident that it can be achieved. So share with us a little bit why you're confident that it can be achieved, and so that we close on a positive note. And also, to what extent you think that individuals, so citizens of our countries, the businesses, and of course the countries themselves, the governments, are ready, willing, and able to take on the challenge?
I mean, before we end on a positive note, I do have to highlight, let's be open, we are not on track. Not in Europe, not anywhere. And that we have to acknowledge. We have to acknowledge that this needs to accelerate very, very fundamentally. And it needs to accelerate in the minds of consumers, voters, politicians, as well as companies. What makes me hopeful are a few things. For one, technically, our challenge isn't technology anymore that much. And essentially, the entire path to net zero can be described technologically already today. 80% of which we can walk with technologies that are ready and scaled today. The last 20% with technologies that we already know today, but that we now have to scale over the next two decades. Two, economically, wherever we look at this, no matter from a country perspective or from a corporate perspective, if you really look into what needs to happen and what it will cost and what it will risk versus what it might gain, in our view, the picture looks a lot more optimistic after you looked at it in more detail than before. There are many countries who can benefit economically from moving to net zero. We've found many companies who can move to net zero at either extremely low costs, some even net zero costs. We've seen many who can commercialize the fact that they do so and that they move early. So economically, I think the challenge is a lot smaller than people think. We still need to invest a lot and change a lot, and that will take effort. What also makes me optimistic is that I think we underestimate how much it takes to change an industry. If you look at how we approach this problem from a communication standpoint, we do often talk about collaboration. A lot of progress over the past decade has been achieved through competition by one company plowing ahead of its sector and just doing something, and the rest of the sector then being forced to follow. And in some sectors, this can work quite fast. If we look at what happened in energy, especially power over the past 10 years, that went fundamentally faster than people expected. And you'll see signs on financial markets today, the way oil and gas companies, for example, have performed over the past years, that the expectations of the financial world is clearly that this transformation will accelerate fundamentally now in the way that these companies are valued. So will we get to 1.5? I don't know. But what I'm absolutely certain about is that what we will see in the coming decade will be a different world in terms of ambition, in terms of speed than what we've seen over the past decade.
Jens, thank you very much. I think one thing's for sure, it's going to be a very exciting and very challenging period. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us. And I'll pass the baton on to the next panel.